Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining the Environmental Justice Practitioners Network webinar on April 12th, 2017. My name is Allie Tharp, the Programs Coordinator for the UAU Ministry for Earth. And our special guest today is Jayeesha Dutta. And would you like to say hello, Jayeesha?
Hey. Am I saying anything other than hey?
Yeah, where are you calling in from?
Hi, I'm Jayeesha. I am here in Washington, D.C., where we are getting ready for the People's Climate March, and this is going to be the art space here. So I'm with the Radical Arts and Healing Collective in New Orleans. I also have been organizing with about 100-ish grassroots groups across the Gulf South for the last few years. Folks who came together in the wake of the BP oil disaster, but now continue to work together on issues of just transition and climate justice in different kind of formations. So, and then other hats and other things I do, but art and social justice and increasingly healing and transformative justice praxis is kind of the intersections at which I choose to do my work.
So glad to have you. And my co-host tonight is Reverend Karen Brammer. Karen, would you introduce yourself?
Let me make sure I am unmuted. I manage the Green Sanctuary program for the Unitarian Universalist Association, and that's where I come from as one of the hosts for this project. One of the things that motivates me so deeply is that I talk to many Unitarian Universalist congregational leaders around the country, and I have to tell you that far more often than one would think, our organizers or our congregational members are organizing out of a sense of despair or a sense of urgency that has not found a grounding in possibility and vision for the future. And my desire for this kind of network and the kind of work that Jayeesha is doing is to help our people of faith find a place and a way, a process to move themselves forward in a way that has beauty. And so they can bring more beauty into the organizing and also more people, more voices. So that's part of what motivates me so deeply, is because I hear the pain in so many of our organizers' voices, many of whom have white hair like me and have been doing organizing work around the environment for many decades and bring some heavy luggage of heaviness. So this kind of work, I think, really will help us reground ourselves in a place of beauty. And strength for the future and resiliency. So I'm so grateful for our teachers. And I think that's all I need to say at the moment. I'm in New York State, about 3 hours north of New York City in my home.
Thanks, Karen.
Okay.
So we'll start with a reading and a chalice lighting and then go into an interview with Jayeesha, and then Jayeesha is accompanied by some other artists in the art space and on the committee for the People's Climate Movement Arts team, so they might join us as well. But before we go into that big portion of the webinar, we had some really serious world news and events happen both in the country and abroad, and I wanted to just name that and have a moment of silence. So particularly in New York, there was the first Muslim federal judge in the history of the United States was found dead, her body in the river. And so regardless of whether it was a hate crime, it certainly would have a chilling effect and cause a lot of pain and fear. And we hold her in our hearts and her community and what this means for our country and the struggles that we face. And the second thing is that one of a bomb that they call the mother of all bombs, which is one of the largest non-nuclear bombs in the United States arsenal, was just dropped in Afghanistan in an act of warfare against ISIS. And so we're in an age of mass war, and it's a hard and heavy time, and a time in which that also will strike a message with communities around the globe that we dropped one of the biggest bombs that we have as a nation. So for these things, and also for the history that these acts come from, with the colonization and white supremacy linked to colonization, that has helped shape the world we live in today. For all people, for Indigenous peoples, let's have a moment of silence. May we hold those missing and murdered, and those struggling to this day with these forces of violence and war in our hearts. Thank you. Now, Reverend Brammer will do a reading for us.
This comes from a woman named Anna Jarrett, who is an Australian storyteller, filmmaker, artist, and activist. The poem is called Grandmother Tree Speaks. Look up into my canopy. Every night I dance with the stars. Look down to my roots, reaching deep into the ground. To my limbs, I have many scars and broken branches. Feel my skin. I have shed many layers, and I am still here, standing strong. Through the seasons and the years, I am still here. Feel me, sink into me, be with me, breathe with me. I am always with you, my child. I am here.
Okay, and with that, we will light our chalice. Okay, so Jayeesha, thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of this very rushed schedule that you're on, preparing for the People's Climate Movement and preparing the art space for the DC mobilization. We're very grateful for your time and presence tonight.
Thank you. Thanks for having me / us in the space.
Yeah, is Remy going to join us? Now's the time.
Yes, he is coming.
Okay, so we will start with an introduction for you, who's our guest, and then we have another additional bonus guest speaker tonight. So Jayeesha, in your bio, you say you're a tri-coastal artivist-scholar, and so I hope you would explain what you mean by that, what you mean by a tri-coastal artivist-scholar, and just give us a bit of information about your work, your focuses, your background, and how those things connect.
Yeah, I mean, I use the word artivist to really indicate the deep connection I believe activism should have with art, and art should have with activism, and can and does and has since the beginning of human expression, and people using art as a way of expressing dissent and change and the voice of our peoples. So there's a lot of different words you could use. I choose that one right now. And scholars specifically, because I'm at this moment also technically doing a PhD, which I'm not a very good student right now, but I am writing a dissertation on the critical nature that art plays in our social justice movement, specifically around building trust and relationships. That, you know, the art making, like the space that we're creating here, like this art build space is kind of a space I hope that we can be, you know, we will transform, but in it and through that transformation of making art for the movement is where a lot of critical foundational relationship building that is, I think, the foundation of our movement happens. So in addition to the art, the product and the beautiful things that we will see, for example, on April 29th, the process that brings people together in making art for our movement is something I'm really into, like really nerd out on in terms of my nerdy self, but also is kind of the center of why I do the work, is to create these spaces of engagement for folks to express themselves in and through art, even though it's very challenging, because the other thing is oftentimes the movement will just be like, make this piece, or like it's just expected for artists to just magically produce things, right? So there's also the tension of like trying to visibilize all the work that goes into this process. Is part of why I'm nerding out as a scholar, is to like, in a way, legitimize the work that we're doing and give it the weight that it deserves, you know, in terms of the process and the product, because I think the process often gets invisibilized because there's a pretty banner at the end or a pretty piece of art at the end.
And so what, can you tell us a bit more about your journey to where you came to be deeply in this work as both a scholar and an active movement organizer, and particularly what were transformative moments for you that led you to take this as your life passion?
That's a big question. Gosh, I mean, I don't know how to answer that, because my family, you know, I'm Bengali. My family comes from a tradition of social change makers, and my mother's but both my parents are writers and poets, and my name means victory for the communist plow, you know. So I feel like to a certain extent I've been, you know, born my whole, I didn't know other ways, you know, like my first writing when I was like 3 or 4 was like some kind of like chant sounding thing that my mom, you know, like, I don't know, it's just how I feel like I've been raised, is to simultaneously be aware of social justice issues, but also use creative expression in art. But for a long time, I think the making art and movement were not as connected in my life. Sorry, there's distractions. Yeah, it's a big question. There was a lot of moments, you know. I think like even being here in DC 20 years ago, I was part of a organizing internship with AFL-CIO, where there was like 4 weeks of, they like exposed you to different organizing models. And I remember my favorite parts being like the art. There was like 2 art builds we got to take, you know, have for 2 of the different mobilizations during that month. And remember specifically the space and the interactions in the making of the art. The art itself obviously being important, but even back then being kind of transfixed by the spaces. And then living in the Bay Area, which I often think of like as my movement boot camp, you know, is like living in the Bay during the, when Bush was bombing Iraq and the whole city shut down. And there was a lot of critical movement stuff that happened back in that time too. And just remembering the art build spaces at that time being this like really transformative relationship building place. So I don't know, I think the process, and then also moving to New Orleans and then kind of encountering the deep cultural organizing practice that is at the heart of how people build in the South in particular, is with stories, with singing, with food, which I think sometimes in the other coasts, so my whole tri-coastal thing is to really also bring the South. I was born in the South, live there now. And I think Southern ways of organizing are very culturally rooted, as well as like Indigenous folks, people of color, right? Like that kind of organizing traditions, I think are very culturally rooted as well. So both the art build, like, so art spaces, and then there's this whole other trajectory of cultural organizing that I think have deeply influenced. And I think you'll see that in some of the things that are happening right now, with, use of story circles and kind of those practices, even at this very moment.
Great. And so can you tell us more about the story circles that you're doing now for the People's Climate Movement and the April 29th mobilization?
I mean, we're hoping, right? Like, I'm hoping they're happening. I'm not actually facilitating many of them, just trying to provide that as a idea of one way to bring people together for this, right? So to use the story circle tradition, which comes out of the Free Southern Theater and the Civil Rights Movement, when John O'Neill and several other civil rights movement artists use story circles as a way to really bring people together and like create theater pieces that then went traveling around. And I think that part of the civil rights movement, the whole cultural organizing traditions that were very foundational in a lot of things that happened, people don't know that tradition comes from there, and that it's also continued. And so there's different practices, but they're generally the idea of people sharing equal time to tell personal stories, and then creating some structure to have a transformative action at the end of the storytelling. So the idea being that, humans have, since the beginning of history, been storytellers. That's what we do, we tell stories, but this particular story circle tradition is like a little bit more structured way of trying to get folks to like get their crosstalk and their synergies to create ideally a piece of work. In that case, I think oftentimes it was theater, but it can be used in different ways to create creative products, but also you can use story circles. In the South, I've seen story circles be used for like policy sessions. Like, you can use the transformative action at the end of the story circle can be any number of like products, but like the process of generation of ideas and concepts and visions from personal stories. So from my lived experience, not my, like coming from your heart, I think is also like one way it's really rooted in the ways in which art speaks to people, because it's about, your heart expression, where you're coming from. So it's this idea of the storytelling, then marrying on to creating art, I think goes really well together. So it's kind of an experiment. We're going to see what happens in terms of trying to take it to this more mass scale of connecting to a march, which oftentimes is much more like you make a sign and you bring it. So it's definitely asking for a much deeper level of engagement. But that is also a hope, is that this strategy of like story circles and creating hopefully some networks, hubs, circles of resistance that can continue past April 29th. So, if you think about all these spaces that we create, they form and then they dissolve over and over again for these like, what if we continue to nurture these relationships? So that's kind of the hope, is that by starting some of these groups that are coming to DC and doing their sister marches all over, then maybe some of these groups that are forming because of this thing, because they start with their individual stories, the likelihood of some there's like more potential for relationships to grow and develop to continue more long haul organizing, which ultimately this should be for, right? This should not be for one flash in the pan action. Like, this needs, like, we are in it, like things that are happening literally as right now today with us bombing, folks close to where my people are from, right? Like, we are in a long haul fight. And so it can't, like, using all the strategies in our toolkits that we know our work. So something like story circles that worked for the civil rights movement are the tools we should be looking at re-envisioning how we can use in this moment.
Are there any aspects of your organizing with the People's Climate Movement that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, Remy, this is a great time for you to say some things. No? Okay, not going to. Sorry. Well, Remy's here and is working on some frontline. There's a frontline artist commission piece to PCM this year where we have 7 artists from different frontlines, depending on how you define that are creating larger scale pieces in collaboration with circles of resistance that they've defined for themselves and their communities that they come from. And they'll be making different versions of larger scale pieces that will be traveling with the march and the frontline contingent, and then will be kind of placed at the end of the march where we're going to have a giant kind of circles of resistance, participatory, practicing our future engagement area. And so these will kind of frame that, all the circles of resistance, that many of which will be circular banners, like large parachute circular banners, will kind of populate the space as people arrive. So I'm pretty excited also about the idea of not having this thing that just goes from point A to point B and then just dissolves. Like in 2014 at the People's Climate March, I just personally remember getting to the end and it was just like a zombie town, and there was everyone was like, you know, the police were there telling you to disperse, and it just was a really weird vibe at the end of this like marathon walk, which was at times, and you know, it was inspiring to see all these people, but the end felt weird. And so to create a really like powerful experience for people, in addition to the, you know, the marching and showing resistance and showing strength and power to this particular political moment, but also providing an experiential engagement for folks to learn and grow and be inspired by stories that they hear, solutions that they see. I'm really super excited about all of that, and like really modeling and centering how we can be bringing the front line to the center of our conversations, and in every way. You know, I'm hoping that really becomes very visible and obvious at this, particularly at the end of this march. So I'm excited about that.
Great. And then the last question I have before opening up the floor for general Q&A is if you would tell us more about the art and community building work in New Orleans with the Radical Arts and Healing Collective. And I know that I've worked with you a lot for defining what a just transition in the Gulf Coast looks like, which communities are included in that, and a radical inclusive vision for a just transition. So I don't want to spill too much of the beans. I want you to kind of tell us in your own words what have been like really inspiring moments for you, let's say within the past couple years of arts-based, community-based organizing in the Gulf Coast?
Yeah, I mean, the Radical Arts and Healing Collective started last January-ish, and you know, I mean, it comes out of multiple members, but specifically, I think myself and Ann Meredith both having very similar wishes at the same time of like wanting to create a space, an intersectional, intergenerational, multiracial, deeply radical, non-traditional movement space and collective, and that centered art. And then I was very clear that for me, it also had to center healing work, and as that being really critical at this moment of as we started the call, talking about all the trauma and harm and heaviness that people hold. So seeing those as going hand in hand. So we started, in March got a space that actually Remy helped open up, and we had an action at the Superdome. It's kind of the first big thing that the collective was produced. And actually it was like the set of banners that we got a lot of pushback from the bigger green organizations in wanting to visibilize the fact that for us in the Gulf South, when you talk about climate change and you talk about climate, like we can't talk about these things without talking about all the intersectional, interrelated issues that are at the heart of extraction and exploitation in the region. And so to really visibilize that when you talk about a just transition, you have to talk about Black Lives Matter, you have to talk about migrant rights, you have to talk about Indigenous rights, you have to talk about, the rights for water and land and air and all of those things, but you have to talk about the deep exploitation and continued oppression of peoples, and how we get to a just transition has to incorporate, economic changes and infrastructure changes, but also deep changes in our social behaviors and practices and kind of the underlying cultural assumptions that we hold. So the work that around just transition for me in defining it has to be, the approaches have to be intersectional and really deeply looking at all the interconnected issues, but also the approaches need to be varied. So using policy approaches, but also cultural approaches, also, direct action approaches, so that there isn't one solution either. So the just transition framework is not just the theoretical model of like moving from extraction to generative economies, but it's also about the way in which we get from that has to be just in modeling the world we want to see. So using all the different practices that we have. So this Another Gulf is Possible collaborative that we've been trying to build, we are building, it's continuing to blossom and grow, is really trying to build, there's a network of us, Chip is part of it, there's like this scrappy group of us who are like doing the work, and how do we nurture that work in a way that is aligned with our values outside of maybe the bigger NGO structures. So it's blossoming, it's happening, it's rooting in using kind of all these practices in the service of transitioning a place where I think a lot of this country has given up on and thrown away, and just deemed a sacrifice zone, and that's just is not okay. It's not going to be okay. So we are using all we can, and particularly for us in our collective is art and healing practice, and however we can visualize that in places like this in Washington, DC, and not just using the image of our region for good press hits because the picture of the BP oil disaster is really arresting. We also need folks to really support us in all different ways in that just transition we're trying to achieve. So.
Great. So now I'll open up the floor for our live participants in the webinar to ask questions. And everyone feel free to ask for advice, ask for more information, ask for a story. Now we're gonna just open it up and see what comes up. Sue? Oh, you gotta unmute. There you go. I've got you.
Okay. I would like to hear a little bit more about the healing work that you've mentioned several times. What specifically does that mean?
I mean, I think that's the part I would love the most. I would love more time to think about that question. I think it's what I feel deeply needed, and in my own small ways do that work for myself at this point. It's like really about how to take care of myself, and I'm not doing a great job all the time, but create kind of some practices and rituals that keep me centered and grounded for others, so I can be there for others in the ways that I need to be. I think the way it shows up the most is through transformative justice lenses that I try to bring, and I know others in my collective try to bring in different contexts and spaces that we're in trying to bring in a frame of trying to transform harms and traumas when and if they happen, instead of some of our society's more detrimental inclinations, which are sometimes to either ignore things, sweep things under the rug and not deal with them, or let things grow and grow and grow until they burst, right? So using transformative justice practices to really address and deal with harms is one of the ways it probably shows up the most, and just bringing that lens in spaces that at least I know I try to, and I know others in the Arts and Healing Collective is also trying to, and I think it's increasingly a thing we're all aware of. The other piece is, increasingly seeing ways in which spirituality and kind of people's whole selves are coming into the movement in different ways that at least I don't feel like I saw, even 10 years ago. So I think part of that is also the dire nature of things, is like people are feeling the need to hold on to faith in a different kind of way right now. So I don't know, that's kind of where I would like to dive in a lot more and personally, I like to think of myself as being in training and like wanting to find ways to go for a couple of months somewhere to learn some practices, and maybe go back to where my folks are from and learn. So I would love the time and space to really authentically own that. But right now, I just know we need it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And yes, we do.
Okay, this is Leslie. I have a strategy question I'd like to ask. I've been finding it's difficult to get intergenerational activity together. And whether it started from one generation or another, the combining just doesn't seem to be happening. And it's very frustrating. And some of us had a lot of experience in climate work and arts work. Some of us have no experience, but the intergenerational teaching or learning doesn't seem to be happening.
I'm curious to know where that's coming from, because I think there could be more. For me personally, I feel like that's something we should strive for more.
Yeah, it's frustrating because I think there's a lot to be learned.
But I think not but, and I actually feel I see a lot of intergenerational, I do think there's more than maybe we think we see, or in different ways it shows up. I think there are certain places you can go and see a lot of intergenerational wisdom and leadership being shown, like very clearly for me when in Standing Rock, it seemed like there was quite a bit of intergenerational building and leadership, both of the elders and of the youth. So I think it depends on which spaces you inhabit and the community, and I think there are some places we can look to for some good models of how intergenerational movement building is happening and has been happening. So I don't know. I would hope that we can always be better, but that it's not there entirely.
I would like to make a quick plug here for our Unitarian Universalist listeners. The work that I'm doing with the UU Young Adults for Climate Justice these days is very arts-based, and we are planning to make artwork for both the People's Climate Movement and to be used for public witness and for worship at the General Assembly this summer in New Orleans. And so if congregations would partner with the UU Young Adults for Climate Justice in this collaboration that we're doing to make artwork and bring it to General Assembly, that's it's intergenerational in itself there, but you can also invite your local young adult groups, invite your DRE to invite the DRE classes to participate in making a puppet or making a backdrop or something like that would be used for our entire denominational justice witness this summer.
I wonder if I can jump in. This is Karen Brammer with the Green Sanctuary Program. And again, I have the opportunity to hear leaders walk through successes and failures and evolving things. And I think one of the learning curves that many of us as adults and older adults are on is that many of us have had the framework in our minds that to build a collaborative event that I, as the older adult, plan it and then invite people to come to it and get frustrated when there's a low level of response or when the young people kind of stand around the edges, but that there's a real shift in energy potential when I, as an elder who holds some of the financial resources and some of the control in the congregation, say, here's reserved space that belongs to you, and we're asking you to think of something that inspires you and think of ways that we might be able to participate with you in doing that. So it's really shifting from, and Leslie, I'm sorry, I don't mean to imply I know what you've tried to do. You may have already tried this, and it's not an easy cultural shift to make, but our young people are accustomed to being disenfranchised, I think, in school systems, in lots of situations where, you know, we invite them to an event and expect them to be excited about it rather than find a way for them to have agency. So that's the piece that I'm witnessing congregations all over the country wrestle with and have real exciting successes with, and frustrations, et cetera. But it's a big cultural shift for us, as I think it would be for much of the mainstream culture.
Okay, can I respond to that?
Please do.
Okay. I agree with you. However, I think it's endemic in our Unitarian Universalist congregations that there is a split, and even young people are not encouraged to do the organizing. And that's a little different than when I was coming up. And I don't understand it because we were encouraged to do that. And now it seems to be the opposite. And I don't know. I just, maybe it's the demographics of the populations or something.
Now I want to tell a story.
Good.
When I was growing up in the youth program with Unitarian Universalism, it really was one of the most important transformative things that I still to this day ever went through in my life, just because of the fact that the model was that it was so based in servant leadership. The adults showed up to ask critical questions and to give rides and to pay, you know, and then the space to lead and the space to do any of the like finer tuning of the program was really left up to us as the youth. And there was a live culture shift in the time that I was coming of age and bridging, which would have been in like 2006, 2007, 2008. So I think there's history we don't have time to really dig into in terms of asking why there's a culture shift, and then also to actually give due credit to the complexity of what's going on here with intergenerational equity and respect and best practices within our faith. But I do want to say that someone, you know, here today was definitely empowered and motivated by the intergenerational respect for youth leadership. And so I champion it. I think it's one of the best things that the UU faith has in its history and its practice. But back to Jayeesha for one last question.
Well, I'm going to hesitate and see if anybody else, Irene, Jackie, Marcia, anyone else want to be asking a question? Okay. So Jayeesha, again, I'm speaking from my role as hearing congregational leaders. One of our other big learning curves, we are realizing we got a gazillion learning curves right now that are like, whoop, straight up, is that we have been, as a culture of Unitarian Universalists, accustomed to doing our justice work as charity. And many of our congregations, not all of them, but many of our congregations are really newly trying to figure out how to shift from charity to solidarity. And so that being rife with fear of making mistakes and all that other stuff that we have to deal with and get over in order to move forward, do you have any stories of or memories of success of people who have been in control positions who are able to step somehow out of that or beyond it in a way to build another way of communicating? And I'd love to hear it, especially around making work of art, or, you know, art spaces or resistance spaces. So I wonder if that triggers any memories or hopes from your perspective.
So the question is, have I seen people step aside to create space for like
Real collaboration?
Collaboration
or followership?
Yeah, I mean, I can, I don't know. I mean, I know what I think should happen. I don't know if I can think of a pristine example of where all the right pieces. I think there's
different. Don't ask for pristine.
There's not. I mean, honestly, it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge because I think a lot of times, folks, particularly, you know, white folks in our current socioeconomic status, that, you know, situation that we're in this country, in trying to confront white supremacy and issues of social and racial justice with good intentions. And the intentions, like you're saying, it turns into, it turns problematic real quickly. And so oftentimes I think the idea of followership, like what you're saying, like taking leadership in ways that also don't abdicate accountability and responsibility, right? So it's, I'm having a hard time seeing that happen in ways that are really both still then supporting those who are being marginalized or oppressed and have been messed with for many years. I was going to use a bad word, but see, I tried and I didn't use the bad word that I wanted to use. But, you know, people have been dealing with that for so long, and it's not also appropriate to just be like, okay, well, just, you know, lead. It's like, yes, take the leadership, but also there needs to be support and resources and provided, that without strings attached, without questions asked, without, you know, all the kind of pieces that sometimes come with that still create the control mechanisms. Right? So it's like to really follow leadership in a way that, you know, when folks are making very clear what they want, what their demands are, what the community needs, to provide that without questions asked, and ask how to support in ways that feel good, that don't trivialize, tokenize, marginalize further, right? Like, so these are, I know what I think should happen. I feel like I'm challenged, honestly, to find places where it's really happening well.
So
I hope that it will. I want to believe that it is, and it's more and more, I'm hoping on folks' consciousness of what it means to be a real ally and stand in real solidarity. But I think there's a lot of work people need to do in understanding the deep and lasting impressions that colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacy have on our psyches and our behaviors and our cultures and our attitudes. And so we have to fundamentally shift like everything. So it's going to be a long-term process, but there are some really clear things that can even happen right now if folks just had some trust and belief that, you know, we should trust the community leaders. We should trust the people who know their issues the best because they're the ones who are impacted by them. And so,
right. And so, Ali, if I have just a minute to ask one more, Jayeesha, say I'm a white minister of a congregation and I'm working with a white social justice or religious educator, and we would like you to come to our congregation to help us learn how to build collaboration in our community through art. And so I'm going to make lots of mistakes in how I introduce myself to you, but essentially what you would like to see happen is I say I have a chunk of money that I absolutely open for the use, as you see, is important for it to be used. I can have a time frame that you've agreed to, and then from then on, what's my role?
I mean, I think it's asked, right? It's so I don't know so I'd give me a thing that people are working on. So whatever
Right.
the thing is, if it's their food sovereignty, for example, so you're supporting the food sovereignty program. And so I think then the question, resources are provided, but resources can look in different ways other than money, right? It can look like providing volunteer support, just coming in and digging, right? Like, I think like those kinds of ways of like providing authentic, real support, getting into literally the weeds in the case of food sovereignty issues, right? And I think the whole thing is about acquiescing control while providing the resources and providing time and providing access to power, access to, all the access that I think oftentimes are invisible access. People don't even think about it. Those things being openly shared, like that's what it's going to take to kind of break down the many, many generations of inequities and that have led us to where we're at right now.
Yeah.
So
That was helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Unless anyone has a very, very burning question, we're going to move on to our story circles. Sue, how are you feeling?
Well, I just wanted to mention that I'm working with Conscious Elders Network, and we're doing grandparents and young children, but I feel like hearing this conversation helps me to know there's another version of that same thing, that we're learning to back off and support, and that's so new for many of us, but I think it's something that we have to practice at all levels.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we are going to hop into a share screen for those who are on their computers. And this will be the basis of the rest of the call. So with the People's Climate Movement, they have circles of resistance to vision our future. And that's what we're calling the groups that we bring together. So the Environmental Justice Practitioners Network that hosts this call is rooted in a vision of strong, networked, principled UU solidarity action for environmental justice. And so it's great to have you on this call. And we here will create a mini little story circle that fits within a bigger story circle for our UU denomination in this work. So we're doing some stuff that's based in work Jayeesha did, bringing in inspiration from the Free Southern Theater story process. And Jayeesha, I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind to talk about the principles of story circles.
Sure. Do you want to flip to that one so I can see it while we talk?
You can't see it?
I just see it right now. It's just showing the first one, the first slide.
Huh.
Did you move it?
I did. What do other people see? Sue, do you see story circle principles?
No.
No. That's bizarre.
See the first slide plus the thumbnail of the other 4 slides. Now I do you, Allie.
Yeah, it didn't really work. Let's try again. What do you see now?
Now I see it.
Okay.
So yeah, the principles here, and I've actually, this will be my first time doing a story circle, not in person. So I think they all make sense still. So a critical piece is that everyone gets the same amount of time, and that can be timed by, there'll be a timekeeper in this case. I think they're pretty short, so it's about 2 minutes, so probably it'll just be a buzzer or something in this case. Silence is sacred, and the idea of everyone gets equal time. If someone finishes early, you continue to sit in silence with the principle that, there's wisdom in silence. Telling your story, so making sure that you're talking about your own personal experience, and ideally also trying to tell a story, a very short story in this case, but that you're telling a story, not an opinion or expounding on something. And listening being the critical piece as well, that especially in the story circle tradition, it's about listening to others, listening to others' stories, not about telling your own story. And in that, since it isn't about your story, just allowing the story that comes when it is your turn, like just whatever you feel on your heart at that moment. And you can pass if you need. The circle can come back to you. And if you, just don't think too much about it. And if you need to, again, you can sit in silence if that is what feels great to you. And then if you have multiple things you want to talk about, just go to the story that feels more vulnerable. If you feel, and this is, again, part of the principle and the intention of story circles is to build trust in relationships. So to go to the place where you feel more comfortable, or the place where you might feel a little more uncomfortable, because that's where the learning might be for yourself and sharing your story. So those are some of the principles.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay, so for this story circle, since we're still meeting each other, we don't know each other very well, let's begin when it's our turn to talk the first time, also introducing, or before we begin, we'll introduce everyone by their name and where they're calling in from. And then we'll have an introduction of the prompt or question, and then we will reflect upon that in silence. And that's a time for you to go into your memory bank and think of one of your stories that relates to the prompt. And for some people, it's multiple stories, and then there's the struggle of letting the story come to you, or the wonderful finding of the story that comes to you to share with the group. And so the sharing piece, again, for this, each person will have 2 minutes to share their story, and we will have a designated timekeeper. And so when you finish early, you'll wait in silence until the beeper goes off. And then I've also found in the online story circles that we did over the past week that it's great after the timer beeps, after we enjoy the silence, that we thank the person who shared their story. So just share a thank you in order to build trust over this virtual distance that we are in. And so after each person shares, you enter the next step of the story circle, which is called snapshots. And everyone will kind of popcorn style spend a few minutes talking about the mind's eye, what you see. And Jayeesha, do you usually do this where you go in a circle and each person says a thing and just keeps going?
Snapshots is popcorn.
Popcorn, okay.
Yeah, snapshots and crosstalk are both just like normal conversation.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, so what pops up in your mind's eye when the people in the circle share their stories, and sharing what we saw or felt. And then the last stage is to discuss the resonating similarities and differences, the themes and commonalities, and the surprising and striking ideas that come up from the story circles. And then supposing, I'll get back to, if you break into smaller groups, I would say you would want to have no more than 8 people. in a story circle together, and especially the crosstalk about the themes, the connections, the major resonating similarities and differences in our stories. We would share back that with the group as a whole after having our smaller story circles. So that's the format. And at this time, I will stop the recording and allow people to do their story circles.